The American Civil War is a cataclysmic event in our nation's history, and the origins of this war can be traced back to the very creation of the nation in 1780 or 87, with the signing of the Constitution, with slavery still intact. And as the nation progressed from that point, the expansion of territory and acquisition of land, such as Louisiana Purchase in 1803, as this map identifies, the issue of slavery and whether slavery was going to be allowed to expand became a central focus of the nation, especially beginning in the 1840s with the annexation of Texas in 1845, the Mexican Cession in 46 and 48, and further westward, as these territories were acceptable for the growth of cotton to a certain extent, and with the growth of cotton, the expansion of slavery. John O'Sullivan's phrase, manifest destiny, the idea that the nation was going to grow indefinitely because of our right, our purpose to be a continental nation, drove this attitude of expansion. But the question that always reappeared was, is slavery going to go along with the growth of the nation and expand as well? The issue of Texas, of course, arises in the 1830s when the nation witnessed Texas attempt to throw off their chains from the Mexican government in their war for independence in the 1830s. But the Americans chose to stay out of that conflict primarily because of the issue of slavery. In that Texas was a slave state and most likely would be introduced as a slave state. And we'll talk about the political imbalance that created or could create a little bit later. But in the 1840s, the annexation of Texas became a focal issue as Texans wanted to become part of the United States, and the emergence of James K. Polk as the president in 1844. His campaign slogan, one of many, was centered around the idea of expansion, and that Texas and the Pacific Northwest should rightfully be parts of the United States. So in December of 1845, Texas was voted in to become the 20th state of the Union with slavery intact. We go to war with Mexico in 1846 over a dispute of borders, as the Texas government the United States government wanted the border to be at the Rio Grande, and the Mexican government wanted the border to be at the Rio Brazos. This war was primarily a political one. James K. Polk, President of the United States at that time, understood that Mexico had been weakened and was a nation that could not compete with the United States. So he pressured the Mexican government into a land dispute, one that he knew the Mexican government really couldn't respond to. And when the Mexican government turned down the pleas of the U.S. government to set the borders at the Rio Grande, he sent Zachary Taylor and the army into the disputed territory, encouraging the Mexican government to go to war. In the West, the California Republic emerges at about the same time. Almost an individual conflict emerges here as the U.S. Army in California begins to challenge the Mexican control of that region. Obviously, California was a wanted territory. More and more Americans had been moving out there since the 1840s, and the idea of manifest destiny brought California into the question of becoming part of the United States. The Mexican War comes to a conclusion with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And under this treaty, the Mexican government gives up vast areas of the American Southwest to the United States in return for peace. On this map, you can see several things. First of all, the territory acquired under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, what of course is California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Arizona, vastly expanding the territorial reign of the American Southwest. And in 1853, James Gadsden was sent to the Mexican government to negotiate for the area south of, as you can see here, the southern tips of New Mexico and Arizona in what became known as the Gadsden Purchase. Now, we may not think of the gold rush as being a turning point in the oncoming of the war, but in 1848, when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California, the explosion of population of California would bring the issue of slavery into question, as California would very rapidly begin to seek admittance as a state into the Union. The population of California within a span of 2 years doubled, and cities like San Francisco went from 5,000 or 6,000 people to well over 100,000 people in a very short amount of time. As we also see is the emergence of different races in the United States. Chinese immigrants brought in during the gold rush in California. The migration of people westward as you get into the 1840s, of course, many people were crossing the Great Plains and the Oregon Trail. Gold is discovered in Colorado in the 1850s, and more Americans are moving onto the plains and expanding westward. And as the populations increased in these territories, the issue of territorial government and eventually states would become more of a central focus of the national government. And with each new state being admitted, the issue of whether or not they were going to be free or slave is brought to the forefront. What we also see is as the nation grows westward, a greater responsibility placed on the federal government to deal with these issues, whereas previously much of the issue of territory, much of the issue of people within the territory was a very localized issue. But in the 1840s and 50s, the government began to take greater responsibility and was looked to for greater responsibility in organizing and setting up these territories in these states. As a result, this issue of slavery is pushed away from the states and into the hands of the federal government. The expansion of slavery, kind of to go back a little bit, begins really in the late 1700s and early 1800s in America. 1793, of course, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. And what the cotton gin did for the cotton industry is it gave them the ability to more rapidly process cotton into a useful product. So instead of having a single individual producing maybe 10 pounds of cotton a day, the cotton gin could produce 10 times that in a day. So slavery grows because the cotton industry grows. Because they could process more cotton, they could grow more cotton. And in the early 1800s, we see the explosion of the cotton producing South. States like Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana now become the picture of American slave society. The things that you would see in books or in movies, the large plantations of hundreds of slaves and a wealthy master and overseers becomes more common. Much different than the slave system of the colonial period that was very small and very much tied to small families and small farmers. In 1846, with the acquisition of the Mexican Cession, the issue comes before Congress as to what are we going to do with these Western territories. And David Wilmot proposed a piece of legislation in Congress known as the Wilmot Proviso. And he was fully aware that this proviso would not pass, but what it does is it brings into light the attitudes of many individuals. During the 1820s and 30s, we see several reform movements take place. The Second Great Awakening, religious revivals, and with that, a greater questioning of the morality of slavery. William Lloyd Garrison and others began to author newspapers centered around the idea of abolition, the immediate removal of slavery in America. And the Wilmot Proviso kind of followed that lead with the idea that no lands in the Mexican territory would be allowed to have slaves. Again, he understood full well that the southern states would never adopt this policy, but it does kind of draw the line in the sand, so to speak, between those who supported and those who opposed slavery. The Compromise of 1850 is kind of the beginning point of the road to the Civil War in terms of a political entity. And in 1850, California was seeking to become a state. And with the idea of California becoming a state, we have the issue of whether or not it's going to be free or whether it's going to be slave. Also, during this time, was the idea that the Western territories would also be organized for settlement. So Henry Clay and others came up with somewhat of a compromise, and as you can see here, the 5 points of possible compromise to appeal to both the North and the South was presented. The debate over the compromise is some of the most interesting in terms of reading and understanding the direction the nation was headed, as you had extremes on all sides. Daniel Webster was kind of the leading northerner from Massachusetts, tended to be viewed as an abolitionist. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, the leader of the hardcore Southern states' rights advocates and pro-slavery. And then Henry Clay of Kentucky, somewhat the compromiser. And whether it's irony or fate, the issue that Henry Clay is the compromiser when he was in from a central located state is just one of those great things in American history you sometimes wonder about. But the debate waged for several months, became very heated, and is marked by two very significant speeches. Daniel Webster's March 7th speech, in which he surprised people, as many thought he would speak of abolition and his support for freedom within the West, and the shocking phrase, "I speak as American." And he goes on to discuss how he supported the idea that what we need to do is what's best for the nation, and that was compromise. John C. Calhoun, very ill at the time, presented his speech. He, in fact, did not speak. He was present, lying on a cot, basically on his deathbed. But he presented the issue from more of a political one. The map here shows you the makeup of the states, free and slave, at the time of the Compromise of 1850. And what you will notice, if you count the number of free states and slave states, is that they were very, very close in number. But what was happening as we go through the process of admitting states is more and more states are choosing to be free. Now, the political ramifications of that is that with each new state that is admitted as a free state, that's two more votes in the Senate for the free states, giving them a greater political power and potentially the ability to vote for the abolition of slavery. And that's what John C. Calhoun is speaking of when he's talking about political imbalance. As long as the number of free states and slave states remained closely related or almost even, you had that balance of power and basically the ability to deadlock or gridlock the issue of slavery in Congress. But what was also emerging was the northern population was very rapidly growing, and more, with that population growth, you have more and more representatives in the House of Representatives to challenge the position on slavery. So the South, as you get into the 1850s, is clearly understanding that they politically in the United States government are losing the ability to control the government through the voting process, and something that in our history up to this point they had not been, because most of the presidents of the United States up to this point had been Southerners, and the reality existed that very soon you could see a succession of presidents coming from the northern states again. And that, of course, struck fear into the Southerners that they would eventually be forced to give up slavery. The compromise does pass, but not until some of the key players are no longer there. John C. Calhoun passes away, Henry Clay passes away, Zachary Taylor, who was president at the time and had vowed to veto the compromise, also passes away. Stephen Douglas, a up-and-coming senator from Illinois, picks up the bill and decides to break it apart. Instead of passing it as an omnibus or one bill, he tries to pass each element of the compromise individually, and is successful in doing so. President Fillmore then had also proclaimed that he would sign it, okay, which he does, and the compromise goes through. And most people felt at this point that the slave issue had been resolved. One of the elements of the Compromise of 1850 was the Expanded Fugitive Slave Act. And what this expansion did was it essentially made it illegal to help slaves. So under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1789, individuals were, or slaves were designated to be returned if they were escaping. But there was no requirements on people who were helping them. And of course, with the emergence of the Underground Railroad and other organizations and abolitionists who were trying to help slaves escape from the South, Southerners were becoming very upset with this type of organizations. So under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, it was now a punishable crime to assist a slave. With this in mind, Harriet Beecher Stowe authored a very scathing book of the Southern slave system and bringing to light the issue of escaped slaves and the challenges that they faced. It becomes very, very popular nationwide as well as throughout the world, and exposing the problems of the perceived problems of the American slave system. The issue of slavery was reborn with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Stephen Douglas proposed the organization of the Kansas-Nebraska territories with the idea of building a transcontinental railroad through Kansas and Nebraska, with the idea, of course, of it being headed out of Chicago, which would be beneficial to him and his Illinois constituents. And to plea to his Southern supporters, Douglas was a Democrat and had designs on becoming president of the United States someday, and fully understood that he could not become a Democratic president without the support of Southerners. He brings back an old idea of popular sovereignty, the idea that states could determine whether or not the issue of slavery would be in existence or not in those states. Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act with popular sovereignty as its basis, and this was very unpopular amongst the abolitionists, because what it really did was it provided an opportunity for slavery to expand into the western territories. And as we'll see as we go through you can identify the political careers of many individuals, whether or not they supported or opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Under the Kansas-Nebraska Act here of 1854, Nebraska and the Kansas territories, as they were admitted as states, would have the opportunity to choose whether or not they were going to be slave or free. This is a violation of an existing rule known as the Missouri Compromise. And you see the Missouri Compromise line here is an 1820 law that resolved the issue of slavery at that time when Missouri was admitted as a slave state and Maine as a free state. But the agreement was anything north of that line would be free. Anything south would be slave. So the idea that popular sovereignty was in existence in the Kansas-Nebraska territories violated the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Political parties were changing, a lot of political unrest for many different reasons, but slavery is a part of it, but we see the emergence of anti-immigrant legislation. A party that develops is called the Know Nothings. It was a very secretive type of society that was made popular in the movie Gangs of New York, with the image here from that movie. Very pro-American were the Know Nothings, and they were anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-Jew, and with that attitude, this was a natural party for abolitionists and others to potentially attach themselves to. The Kansas-Nebraska Act opened up Kansas. Kansas petitioned to become a state in 1854 and 1856. And what happens is we see a flood of people into the Kansas territory to try and stop Kansas from being a slave state. Abolitionists sent their family members to move to Kansas to increase the voting population of abolitionists, and also bordering a slave state of Missouri. Many elections were, I guess you could say, flawed because many Missourians crossed the border to vote in the Kansas elections, resulting in very unrealistic terms. The result is Kansas breaks out in violence. Individuals such as John Brown will raid pro-slavery camps. The abolition or pro-slavery supporters of Missouri will move into Lawrence, Kansas on several occasions and commit atrocities, killing individuals. And Kansas becomes known as Bleeding Kansas because of the extensive fighting that is taking place. And some mark this as the beginning of the Civil War, as violence is now breaking out in Kansas and kind of setting the tone for the direction of the nation as it moves forward. In Congress, we also see the violence emerge. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts is brutally attacked by Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina after Sumner had publicly insulted a family member and fellow senator of Brooks. Brooks went into the Senate chamber, and in this image here that became very popular, brutally beat Charles Sumner over the head with a cane. And while some people, of course, viewed this event as horrific, Southerners mailed new canes to Preston Brooks to replace the one that had been damaged in the beating of Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner himself never fully recovered from his injuries and became one of the first casualties of the American Civil War. Politically, as we approach, 1856 begins the process of the political emergence of a third party, the Republicans, a party that is created out of the Whigs and out of the Democrats with an idea of abolition as kind of a central issue, as well as expansion. John C. Fremont is chosen to run as a Republican, but James Buchanan, a Democrat, wins the election, primarily because James Buchanan had been out of the country when serving as a foreign diplomat when the Kansas-Nebraska Act is voted on. So he had no record on whether or not he supported or opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the expansion of slavery and popular sovereignty. So he had nothing that no one could challenge him on. And Buchanan, in his nature, obviously he wasn't the type of individual to share much, so you didn't know what his position was. 1857, the Dred Scott case is handed down by the Supreme Court, and Dred Scott was a former slave of a military doctor who had lived in northern states for many years, and after the death of his owner, he chose to sue for peace, or sue for his freedom in the court systems. And the court systems, it progresses up to the Supreme Court of the United States. And in the Supreme Court of the United States at this time, the majority of the justices were Southerners, and Chief Justice Roger B. Taney himself, a slave owner. And what the court hands down here is kind of a finality of the slave issue, a legal document that could define whether or not slavery was constitutional or unconstitutional. In Taney's statement, he issues that slavery can only be prohibited by individual states, supporting the idea of popular sovereignty and opening the door for the expansion of slavery into all territories west in the United States. But more significantly is this statement of a Negro had no rights which a white man was bound to respect, identifying the Negro not as a human being but as property in the United States. And because they are property, property is protected under the Constitution and cannot be taken away by the federal government. From this point on, Southerners rejoice because they feel that the slave issue is now resolved, and they could move forward with the expansion of slavery without fear of federal intervention. 1858 is a senatorial election year, and the emergence of Abraham Lincoln as a national candidate. He is running against Stephen Douglas in the state of Illinois, and in a series of debates, the central focal issue is, of course, slavery. In 1858, he issues his famous House Divided speech, basically stating that the nation cannot exist half free or half slave. Douglas makes a critical error in these debates in which Lincoln asks him whether or not slavery could be prevented. And Douglas says yes, through popular sovereignty, clearly identifying that the federal government could influence and prevent slavery from expanding. This is critical to Douglas because he now took a position that slavery could be prevented from expanding and growing into the western territories, something that would hurt him in upcoming elections when he wanted and needed Southern support. 1859, John Brown, who had, of course, became popular for his violence in Kansas, decided to push the issue out of the Dred Scott decision and the idea that slavery was going to expand. Brown and other radicals decided that maybe it was a time to go into the South, try and arm the slave population, and create a rebellion of slaves in the South, forcing the United States government to do something. So he led a raid in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, to capture weapons and make available for the uprising. He does capture the weapons, but the uprising does not occur. And Colonel Robert E. Lee is sent by the U.S. Army to go into Harper's Ferry and capture John Brown, which he does, and John Brown is executed for treason. But this event marks the beginning of organization of the Southern military. From this point on, the Southern states and local communities begin to arm themselves and organize themselves in militias to deal with a possible uprising should it occur. 1860 is another presidential election year, and the Republican Party is an emerging party that is becoming very popular. And on here you see their platform. And what's interesting with the Republican Party in 1860 is that it is very pro-government. The idea of preventing slavery from expanding, protective tariffs for protecting American industry, government money to build a railroad connecting east and west, government money for internal improvements to try and get the nation to encourage settlement of the West, and then the idea of free homesteads, giving land to Americans to move into the Western territories. Largely they wanted people to move there because they wanted to populate the West with the idea that the West would become free. Abraham Lincoln wins the presidential election of 1860. He is not a candidate that many supported. William H. Seward and Salmon Chase, hardcore abolitionists of the Republican Party, were considered to be the front runners when the Republican National Convention met in Chicago in 1860. But what the Republicans quickly realized is if they're going to win a presidential election, they needed someone who could win both North and South, or so they believed. So Chase and Seward were unrealistic candidates because of their hardcore abolitionist beliefs. Abraham Lincoln becomes a popular candidate primarily because he is unknown and had never really taken a complete abolitionist stance. He was not for slavery, but he did not fully support the idea of immediate abolition. So after several ballots, they make a deal and work it out, and Abraham Lincoln wins the Republican nomination. The Democrats divide. Stephen Douglas is chosen by the Democrats, but Southerners did not support Stephen Douglas, so they left the convention and chose their own Democratic candidate, John C. Breckinridge. So now you have a divided Democratic Party, essentially dividing Northern Democrats with Southern Democrats, weakening their national voting power. The Constitutional Union Party chose John Bell, an individual with the idea of compromise and just trying to hold the Union together as best as possible. The presidential election, of course, is widely divided, as you see on the map, very regionally divided. Abraham Lincoln wins, primarily because of the greater population in the North. The reality that is very clear here for Southern states, though, is that now you have a president elected who was not on the ballot in many Southern states, and most people in the South did not vote for. So they fully understood that from this point on, the